Welcome to AMM 120, Migration and Urbanization in the U.S. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about migration patterns and overall what we're looking at in terms of urbanization. So we start off with what is migration. So obviously it's mobility from a geographic standpoint. Relatively permanent, but people do change. And we look at very clearly defined units or areas, demarcations, and there's dimensions of time and space. So we look at how many times people move within their lifetime, how many moves we have within the year, and how it adds or subtracts members to a population. Now, why is this important? Because it helps us look at population growth, definitely important for the labor force, and helpful for projections and population estimates. So different types of migration patterns. We do have voluntary and involuntary. So voluntary is basically because you want to move. Involuntary, it's because of forces out of your control. So voluntary is because you wanted to move. So if you wanted to go to school at a different state or a different country, if you choose to get a job somewhere else farther away and you move, maybe you make more money and you want to upgrade. Involuntary is when, let's say, you make less money and you have to downgrade out of necessity, or you got kicked out of where you live. Things that really aren't, you dropped out of school, things like that, things that are basically, you don't have full control over, and you didn't want to move, but you had to. Now, overall types, international, national, and local. So international, you're crossing into a different country. So you're crossing an international border. And a lot of people find this weird. They think local migration is easier to control, but it's actually international because it's regulated. Countries have limitations. They will limit who they allow in the country, or they have specific parameters. We're usually looking at 2 to 3 million people per year. National, it's between states. Okay, so very little control. It's typically because of employment opportunities and education. You're going, college and retirement. So we do see people retiring. Certain schools obviously depends on the program that you want to do. Retirement, Florida seems to be the retirement capital of the world. Seeing more people also retire in Texas and certain other parts of the U.S., but those are the main areas where you see people retiring. Local within the city or region, typically change of income or lifestyle. You're upgrading, you're moving an apartment to a home or a condominium. So it's local. You stay within the city. Your zip code might not even change. You might even stay within the same area. Now, the reason we say it's harder to control versus international is because it's harder to pinpoint and keep track of, because when it's local, sometimes it does get missed by the census because your zip code stayed the same, you're in the same area, so the move doesn't count if you stay within the defined area. So, for example, when I was young, we stayed in the same apartment building, but we moved from Unit 6 to Unit 9. So everything stayed the same except for the unit number, so that didn't get counted as a move in the census. So technically we did move, but it didn't get counted. So it's harder to control, and you can't obviously limit. So it's harder to keep track of. Now, just to get a little historical perspective, we've had millions and millions of immigrants, definitely in the late 19th and early 20th century, to escape basically really difficult conditions. They came here for a better life. And what's interesting is we call them birds of passage because the intent was to only come here for a short period of time, make more money, and go back to their homeland. It just turns out a lot of them did stay. But, people would send money back to their homeland or return. Now, because we've spoken about this before, assimilation, we see when it comes to immigrants, all different levels of assimilation. So those that want to assimilate to American culture, in fact, you see that more here, that they're committed to their culture, but they're also trying to become Americans. So, that's why we have terms like Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Chinese or Asian Americans. You didn't, Mexican Americans, you don't have that in other places. You don't see German Americans or German Polish or Chinese German or German Chinese hybrids. You don't hear that, um, because it's just not, how you see the assimilation in those countries. Whereas here, you can commit to your own culture still, and do various levels of assimilation. Now, those that did not assimilate to at all, or very little, to American culture, they kept to themselves, and that's how these ethnic communities were created. So Chinatown, so like Koreatown, Chinatown, things like that. Now, in our historical perspective, just so you understand, we had rapid, not just fast or it happened. No, rapid really fast urbanization in the late 19th century in the Northeast and Midwest. So most immigrants did settle in cities because that's where the jobs are and affordable housing. Now, when you look at urban areas, the bigger cities, the housing isn't as affordable, but the jobs are there. By early 1900s, immigrants made up more than half the population of the 18 major cities. Now, the problem is that the level of immigration was too rapid, and major problems were housing and sanitation. So we just had too many people. They just were overcrowded in the housing, and the sanitation was bad because the garbage wasn't collected, often not collected. It created a lot of pollution, a lot of rodents. This isn't a drawing, mind you. This is a photograph. Very famous photographer. Um, in this isn't someone's interpretation. This is an actual photograph. It was rough. It was rough back then. So overcrowded. They kept building these wooden buildings, but with no adequate um, uh, ways to sustain it. So transportation was a problem. We had overcrowded, so transit systems were not adequate. Water, we ended up limitations on water, so that's where you had the cholera and typhoid fever outbreaks. If you look at historical perspectives on major cities like Sacramento, Chicago, San Francisco, etc. Now, as populations increase, you had a rise in gangs and crime. Um, Let me use movies like Gangs of New York, etc., to show that. And the fires. If you look at the history of all the major cities in the United States, they all have one main thing in common. Well, two. They had outbreaks of cholera and typhoid, but big thing is they all had fires. They all had major fires because we had limited water supply back then. Those very badly constructed wooden structures, and they didn't have electricity. They had candles, so that led to a lot of those urban fires. And because it was hard to get to that part, it just allowed the fire to escalate. So the Chicago fire, San Francisco fire were two of the major ones. So late 1800s and early 1900s. So yes, if you look at all the history of these major cities, fires were a huge problem back then. So as you can see, from 1850 to 2010, the immigration foreign-born population, you can see, and it has its fluctuations. So it would go up and then would go down a little bit, and then up and down and up. And then we definitely had a drop in the 70s, in the Great Recession and oil crisis in the 70s, oil crisis, and then it did go up. We did have a dip at the Great Recession, but not not too bad. So we've had basically an increase in immigration, very steadily increase. So these are just definitions. Make sure you read these: immigrant and immigrant and outmigrant and emigrant. So basically, when you're moving into the political area in the same country, or if you're crossing an international border. So you're either going in or you're going out. And it's either crossing an international border or you're not. So again, crossing the national boundary is easier to control and monitor. Again, that's why you need passports and visas. There's laws to control them, to increase, to inhibit or limit these movements. So, any country has, obviously, and all countries have this. I know it's been a big thing lately in the U.S. With the immigration, but all countries have, obviously, immigration rules and laws. Between 2 million to 3 million, roughly, of people emigrate each year in the U.S. Between the mid-60s and 2000, we had 175 million people that have migrated. So that equals about 3% of the global population. So that's a lot. So just so you can understand how it worked before 1914, open policy, just show up, major source of labor, um, and they were coming from developed, Europe to developing countries like, going to developing countries like America, Africa, and Australia. 1920s and 30s, we kind of had a closed door policy because of the Great Depression. So this is where they enforced deportation of immigrants. So very limited migration. After the mid 1940s, a more open policy, Reconstruction in Europe, 12% of the labor force, and we did have economic growth in America. So after the war, our economy did bounce back. So Europe was in reconstruction phase, so it made sense for them to want to come here. So this is where we see the beginning of shift from developing to developed countries. That's a pattern that we see. And then after the 1970s, relatively open. We do have some stringent requirements when you go through the legal process. Can take years, and it is very stringent. However, we have had a growth of refugees and illegal immigration. We don't necessarily enforce all our laws. Some laws are said that they should be modified, but it's just they're not necessarily implemented. So this is just so you can see the world migration routes since the 1700s. They're color-coded, so red is European. This is African, and primarily when we had slaves. When slaves were imported to other countries, Indian, Chinese, and Japanese. So you can see their migration patterns. So legal immigrants, so the type of immigrants that we have. Legal immigrants are citizens from other countries and that have acquired a visa that allows them to live and work permanently in the U.S. And generally, after 5 years, they can become naturalized U.S. citizens. So generally, it's after 5. Some have taken up to 7 years. But it takes a lot of years, so it can be very stringent. That's why they say that some of the laws do have to be reformed, so it's not so hard when you go through the legal process. That's why it encourages people to want to come here illegally, because legally it's very difficult. We also have refugees that are people that are granted legal residency and they have to be able to prove it, but well-founded fear of persecution, either because of their race, their religion, nationality, or particular membership to a group. We're looking at about 75,000 a year. Now, this has been a recent controversy because we have the Syrian refugees. But the process of vetting was never really put in place. So the idea is, does it compromise national security because they're not properly vetted, etc., things like that. So, but we do definitely accept refugees. We have, we're looking at in the thousands that have been resettled. We also have temporary visitors. They're here for just a specific time period, typically either business or tourism. So either an extended tour, like they're touring, they're on vacation, but it's not like a week vacation. It's for a long, 3 months. Like touring across the United States, for example, or for business, maybe a project that is going to take a month or 2 months or 3 months or 4 or 6 months or whatever. They're not planning it to be permanent, but it's definitely more than just visiting. Also, getting a college degree would give you grant you temporary visitor status. If you're going to college at a different country. So we're looking at about roughly on average 35,000 to 40,000 of temporary visitors in the U.S. Now, this one, if you don't come here through the proper channels, whatever you want to call it, some people get very offended. So whether you want to call them unauthorized, undocumented, illegal, whatever you want to call them. But basically, you weren't born here and you don't have a valid visa. Okay, so people here that are here and didn't go through the proper channels. It did peak in 2008, fell to 1 million in 2010 and 2011 because of the recession, and has still gone up after that. Over half are Mexican, but we have had an increase in Mexican immigration. So we are experiencing a decrease, but still of those that immigrant that come here, we have a little over half being Mexican. And this is just so you can compare from 2006 to 2010, how many are actual legal immigrants, temporary visitors, from all the different categories, so you can get an idea. I gave you a link so you can see who's coming to the U.S. and who's coming to the U.S. population, so you can get an idea. But as you can see, Mexican immigrant population is at a decline, so as you could see, compared, it had a very steady incline, and now we've experienced that decline. So that decline is actually still coming in, but again, of those that are coming in, we still have more of them being from Mexico. This is very cool. I'll show you in class week 10, but this is an interactive map, so I'll move this down so you can get the link. But basically, it's kind of cool because it's an interactive map. Okay. Now we can get it to work again. Sorry about that. Okay, so local migration, no state boundaries are crossed, and typically buying a new house or again upgrading, and again difficult to research since it's usually missed in the census data. Okay, so the most common reason, again, change of income or lifestyle. We have often very high levels of local migration. The days of living in the same place for 20 years is becoming more and more uncommon. It used to be commonplace here. We're looking at an average of that Americans moving or changing residence about every 5 to 7 years. There's that 2 year gap just because we're not entirely sure, because again, local migration, it doesn't always get caught in the census data. But about every 5 to 7 years, what we're projecting is that that's actually going to it's actually going to be more moves. So we're looking at in shorter period of time. So we're expecting it to hit every 4 to 5 years, for example. This is a link. I won't show you just because it'll freeze, but it's a really cool interactive map from Forbes where it shows migration streams. So when you click in a county or an area, a city, what it does is it'll show you these lines in 2 colors, and you can enter a zip code, but one will show you migration stream, groups of people immigrating to that city and where they're coming from, and people leaving that city where they're going to. So it's a really neat interactive map so you can see migration patterns. This next slide is just to show you how to calculate migration. So gross migration, we do look at gross and net. So gross migration is total number of people coming in and out of an area. So it's volume. So it's another way of calling it level of population turnover. So people coming in and also leaving, that total number, that's gross migration. Net migration is the difference between people coming in and leaving out. So if it's positive, there's more people coming in, and we call that a population growth. If it's negative, it means more people are coming out. Most people call it a population decline, but actually any population change in your textbook by demographers, any population change is considered population growth, and it's a change. But typically when it's a negative value, we say it's a decline in the population, and that would be the net migration. So this is just a schematic so you can see. So this is, for example, area A, population 1,000, area B, population 500. So if you're going to calculate for this example gross migration, it would be 150 because you're just adding people coming in and people leaving. That's the total. That's gross migration. But if you were to calculate net migration, you'd have to subtract 50 from 100, and you would get a positive value of 50. Okay, so you have population growth because 50 more people came in than left. Okay, so that's straight from your book. So that interactive map has migration streams. So again, people who migrate from one specified area to another in a specific time frame, and a counter stream would be in the opposite direction. So why people come here? They come here for a better life, typically better job security, and can they achieve that? We do have, and do we pursue more of amnesty, or do we pursue deportation, or is it a balance of both? Who knows? We do have about 11 million unauthorized immigrants living here. Some say they should be deported. Others support a path to legal residency, but don't agree as to how to achieve that. And just the logistics, you can't deport 11 million people. That's too many. And what would be required to receive amnesty? Because one thing you do have to keep in mind is those that came here illegally. You have to be fair to them as well. But now that we talk about path to citizenship, the question is, how do you give them legal status? And do you, the same opportunity to them? If not, how do you reconcile that with the idea of ideal or equality, and how does it work? And visa eligibility, and do we change or modify what we currently have? The quotas we have now are very complicated, and sometimes you when you have people here that are not legal, they're getting paid at a table, they're not paying taxes, they don't get counted for a lot of the stuff, so they get underrepresented, and that means there's no representation, and we got to keep them protected as well. So you have to keep it fair, but how do you do that? Enforcement, I definitely would say enforcement's an issue right now. Border security, deportation, and fines, it's just not consistent. We do have sanctuary cities where they said if there's a crime committed by someone who is here illegally, they will not report them to the federal government. So we do have to decide how we're going to enforce it. Most countries do enforce their laws when it comes to immigration. But you got to be realistic and something that reflects goals and values in the American culture. But it is definitely a big issue, especially with the new presidency and the cabinet and how they view it and what laws or what are they going to try to establish. It's so chaotic since the election. Who knows at this point? Big talk was the wall, and how anti-immigrant the new administration is, and some say there's no such thing as an illegal person, like no human is illegal. So reform and what should be reformed and what should be enforced, etc. Definitely the refugee situation is an issue. World refugee population, this is according to the UN, at the end of 2012, and as you can see, have the breakdown, so you can see where they're expecting a higher refugee population. Distribution, we look at nation of origin, destination, age, and sex. That's typically what we look at. We tabulate. And just so you can get, again, an idea, we'll also look at, this is based on the census, but where places have domestic gain, net gain, and losses when it comes to population. In terms of distribution, we look at number of moves. We definitely want to get the average moves per unit of time. So how many moves per year, or for, in our case, every 5 to 7 years. Probability of ever moving. And again, we look at age, sex, race, etc. Now, a couple of things that you do need to understand when it comes to immigration. We have what we call brain drain, where we do see countries where they'll sponsor a gifted or a promising individual. They'll pay for them they'll leave their family, they'll pay for them to get an education here in prominent fields like engineering, medicine, etc., with the idea that they'll come back and bring that knowledge. They'll study at a prestigious school here and they'll come back with that knowledge. But the problem is that they're not coming back. They either get married, they stay here, and that's a benefit for the receiving country because we're getting your best and brightest of other countries, but that's a problem with the country of origin because they're the ones that it was an investment. They sponsored the individual, they paid money, and they're not getting a return. They're expecting the return to come later, and it doesn't come. So that's a problem. Just to give you an idea, 30% of Mexicans that have a PhD, they're in the U.S. They don't go back. So that's an issue there. Now, where do they move to? Obviously, you want developed countries, but we do have developing countries that are rapidly expecting to have an increase in urban population. So where we expect a larger increase actually is not in the developed countries like the U.S. in blue. We're expecting it in developed countries. More jobs are popping up as the technology is filtering there. So again, the growth that we're expecting for urban population is in developing countries, not developed countries. So in terms of concepts overall in urbanization, it's just not new. Obviously, people want to go to areas in larger cities and towns where there's jobs and opportunities. Now, there definitely is a segment of the population that wants more quiet and more space, and they want more of the suburban lifestyle. But people flocking and wanting to go, a higher desire to establish cities. They have better medicine, typically better medical facilities, jobs, more entertainment. I mean, that's not new. So urban growth is just the growth of urban dwellers, and urbanism is just a way of life because it is different. It's more fast paced. If you go to large cities, it's much faster than in small towns. So keep that in mind, that the lifestyle is different, and you know, obviously the lifestyle takes some adapting and getting used to. But people do flock to where there's entertainment, where there's um, more job opportunities. Just realize that the standard of living is more expensive. So when the climate's better, like us right here, Southern California, it's expensive property, gas, everything. The standard of living is more costly, but it's, we have more better climate typically. We have a lot more entertainment. We just have more options, a lot of job opportunities typically, and that is very desirable. So this is just a map chart for you to compare population living in central cities and versus suburbs. Central cities are in the darker and suburbs are in the lighter color, so you can get an idea. But realize that in urban areas, obviously, it's more expensive. Dwellings are getting too small. Is it possible to go too small? I posted an article, but we started with these micro units, right? Like studio apartments, like you have apartments, right? And then you had studio, right? Which was like a big bedroom, a big room and a bathroom, but you had a kitchenette. And they started getting a little smaller and they went to about 300 square feet. And that's what we call a micro unit. Okay. And this is just a little bit of schematic floor plan. But then they've talked about going even smaller, 177 square feet, you know, 250 square feet, from 300 to 250 to 177. It's really small. And they're still charging a lot of money. I mean, some of these are going for, especially like in San Francisco, over $1,200, and there's very small units. And New York is also extremely expensive. So, are they taking advantage of people and their desire to live there? It's up to you to decide. Just realize that obviously the dwellings are going to get smaller. If you're looking for a property, less yard, some of those amenities are gone. It's going to be noisier. It's going to be more crowded. You're closer to work. If you want more bang for your buck, you have to go farther away from the urban cities, but then that means a longer commute for work typically. But you get a larger property typically, some yard, more outdoor space. But again, you have to make that call. You just have to be realistic. I do see people that they want to buy their first property and they want it all. They want it close to all the entertainment amenities, and they want large square footage. They want to get a good deal and pay little. It doesn't work, and they want it quiet. Well, it's not going to work that way. If you want to be in the middle of everything, it's going to be noisier. If you want to be further away, more quiet, you're going to be farther away. So as long as you're realistic of your expectations, if you feel they're taking too much advantage of people wanting, because that's what the contractors say, we're just trying to fulfill demand, and more units, smaller units means you can cram more in there. So there obviously has to be a demand for that to work. And lastly, in terms of, so you can understand the world population increase, these are just obviously estimates. We're going into 2020. But developed countries and developing countries, obviously we're expecting the growth in developing countries is going to be more parallel to the world population growth versus developed countries. So the urban population, again, we're expecting it to be mostly on developing countries that we're going to see the increase. It's going to be much more subtle in developed countries. Okay. All right. And largest cities in the world, just so you can see, some people think LA is a little bit higher, but LA's down here. But Tokyo definitely has been number one, has a very high population count. And then you have several other cities, Mexico City, Bombay, etc. But LA's in there, so you can get an idea. And the bars, the orange is 2015 versus the lighter one, which is from 2010. And cities over 5 million people in the population, we have several: Chicago, New York, LA. We have several, but as you can see, other countries as well have a pretty large population. So typically where you see larger populations is where you've also had some larger immigration counts as well. All right, well, hopefully this helped, and thank you for listening.